So welcome everyone to our third lecture on Agile Methods. As you recall, the very first lecture we talked about the origins of Agile software development from the Agile Manifesto and some of the early practitioners, and we talked about one of the earlier forms of Agile development, which is extreme programming, or XP. That was in lecture 1. The third lecture is going to be focused on Kanban after we looked at Scrum in lecture 2. So today we're going to be doing Kanban. And this, like Scrum, is Agile and is also what we would consider to be lean. How many of you have heard of Kanban before? I'm seeing a lot of no's and a few I haves. So first, a little bit of history on this. So Kanban is actually a method that is not originating from software, but it actually is taking some ideas from lean manufacturing Kanban in Toyota. So it's actually taking some ideas from using from methods for manufacturing development and applying them to software. And there's a couple of resources that I used. Oh, that's interesting. Somebody said they had an IT co-op and they actually used it there. Okay, that's cool. I'd love to hear more about that. And someone else is mentioning they did it as well. Okay, interesting. So some people with some experience. So maybe after what we'll do towards the end, for the students who just mentioned it, I'll maybe ask if you wouldn't mind mentioning about the variations they did there, and we can have that in the recording or not. Okay, so today the resources I've got listed here that I used for this, so if you want to know more, always check out those resources. They're listed in the resources section on the course website. Okay, so again, Agile values and principles, and they inform practice in particular development methods. So we've already looked at XP, we've already looked at Scrum, today Kanban. So what is Kanban exactly? Well, Kanban, this is a quote here, Kanban is all about visualizing your work, limiting work in progress, and maximizing efficiency or maximizing flow. Kanban teams focus on reducing the time it takes to take a project, or it could be a user story. Remember, user stories are sort of the basic unit of work. We've seen the user story in both XP and Scrum before, from start to finish. They do this by using what's called a Kanban board and continuously improving their flow of work. So if you read this description, and I put this quote here, what are the things you should take away from it? Well, one of them is they say limit work in progress. That means they don't want to have too many things on the go. They want to get things that are started, done. So the more things, so rather than having 20 things you're working on, let's try to have 10 things or 5 things and have more of them finished. So the idea is to finish them fast, or efficiently, I guess, is the idea. And part of the way you limit the work and finish things fast is by maximizing the flow. And the flow, or the efficiency, is talking about the flow of items that come from the to-do kind of idea to being in progress to being done, if we want to take a very specific perspective on it. So that means the idea of taking things from start to finish. And that could be at the project level, or it could be at a user story or individual task level. And this idea of a Kanban board is something I'm going to show you in a sec, but this is a visual representation of the workflow in your project or in your team that you can use to get a clear idea. And you may recall when we talked about extreme programming, I mentioned to you that there was somebody who I knew who worked for a XP shop over in the UK. They had this thing where all of the stories that they were working on in a given quarter would be on basically sticky notes on one glass wall in this office space. And as people were working on stories, they would take them off that wall, they would stick them to the edges of their monitor or on their workspace, and then when they were done they would put them on the opposite wall saying they were done. And what this did was it gave everybody on the team and everybody walking by who may have been management or on other teams a clear idea of where they were within the quarterly work cycle in terms of how many of their stories they had completed and how much they had to do and who was working on what. So that was an idea of using visualization and visual representation of work in extreme programming. In Kanban, rather than sort of rely on the team to think about their own ways to visualize in their own space, Kanban explicitly states how they think you should represent the workflow in terms of this board. And let's actually look at this and we'll see what it means. So if we go and look at this now, we can see here that, in fact, sorry, just one second. So what we can actually see here is we can see an example of a Kanban board here. And I just did this one up. It isn't really, it isn't a real board from a real project. It's just a representation. But here's the basic idea. The whole blue thing is your Kanban board, okay? Every column in this board represents a stage of workflow in your development or in your process. In addition to that, every one of those little squares that are in a given column, those are cards that are used to represent work items or tasks. Now you might ask, what's the difference between a yellow, a green, a pink? Okay, that is dependent on the top project you're working on, the team you're working with, and so on. They may actually be in reference to, for example, different types of work items, right? New features, enhancements, fixes. They could, colored by that. They could be colored by certain large groupings of sort of, these are interface tasks. These are sort of more systems tasks. They could relate to, if you had 3 different major stakeholders, they could relate to the stakeholders and who those features or who those work items relate to. They could also be prioritized, right, as well. So there could be a lot of reasons for using color in different things. But in any case, each of them represents a work item, a task, a story, user story that needs to be worked on. And as the flow of these cards go from the backlog all the way to shipped, and my head's in the way, but if you sort of look here, you can see the shipped. So going from backlog to shipped is going from start to finish in our workflow, okay? And the other thing to note about is there happens to be, in this case, 7 different columns, right? We have a backlog, then we have prioritized, we then have ready, we have designed, coded, tested and reviewed, and shipped. So the idea here is backlog is everything. Prioritized are the things that we know we need to do soon. Ready are things that are ready to be done, meaning any other items that they are dependent on, that kind of thing could already be completed. Designed mean things that we've actually got the design solution for. Coded means that we're currently implementing them. Test and reviewed mean we've tested the system or we're testing the system with that item included. And then once it's ready to go and it's been released, we move it over to shipped. And those happen to be the items I chose. Those are the categories I chose, the columns. Depending on your organization and so on, work items or could be represented, it could go into different columns with different names than the ones I have here, right? You could just simply have backlog, active, shipped, right? Doesn't give you as much detail, but technically that's a Kanban board. I see an interesting question here from one of the members of the class, and it says, does that mean we can't go backwards in the Kanban board? Well, that's a great question. So think about, what does it mean to go backwards? First off, the flow is forward, right? So you always want to be moving things from left to right, although I just realized it, my left to right. So in this case here, what we want to be doing is we want to be moving things and advancing them. But there could be a case, for example, what about if a particular work item, let's take that yellow square that's right there in the up here and code it. Oop, I realize my screen only goes this far. Or let's take the yellow square right here in tested and reviewed. What about if in this yellow square, as part of the testing, we identified that there was some design issue with how this was implemented? Well, while not ideal, that could indicate that that yellow square has to be moved back to the design phase or the design step. So we could actually move a square backwards, but it's not something that we would want to do. So it's important that at each of these stages they get signed off on and that they get validated, so that you have a validation that the design for that little work item was validated as being correct, that the coding was validated as being correct before the system testing. But it is possible that you could move something back if it was done inadequately at a previous stage. But there are usually safeguards in place, and we'll see that in one of our examples to understand that. And part of that is actually in what's called done rules, which we heard about briefly with Scrum. And that's the idea of when you can move a card to the next step. And you shouldn't move it until it's completely designed, or the code is completely done and validated, typically. Does that answer your question? Great. If anyone else has other questions, please ask. Happy to answer them. Or if you've had experience using Kanban and I'm describing something different to what you did in your company, feel free to mention what you did and say, hey, what's the trade-off here? In general, just like any of the other design or development methods, Kanban is one of these methods which can be adapted to the individual needs of a company or a team, right? The board's columns can change. How you represent work items can be different scale sometimes, that kind of thing. So there is some variability here. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Kanban board. Well, but the development method, it's a development method. It's not just an artifact. It's not just creating this board. If you have the board, you do Kanban. There's more to Kanban than just the board. So let's actually go a step further and let's actually look a little bit more at what Kanban means. So Kanban, in addition to sort of having this board, has a number of principles that you will recognize from our other discussions on Agile. One of the principles it has is the notion of continuous release. So you'll notice in that Kanban example I had was a shipped column. That only makes sense if you're continuously releasing it. Otherwise, if you're not releasing frequently, you're not actually going to be able to get things finished or done, because things are going to get stuck at that second last stage because you're never ever going to have shipped them if you only do for example, a release every 6 months. So part of the idea in Kanban is that you want to release frequently. That means releases can happen anytime, and they should happen a lot of the time. Another thing is that they ascribe to as a principle in Kanban is the notion of collective ownership. And what that means is, it means that if we go back and we thought about that board, say you're working on, remember in that example I gave you from extreme programming, where I said an individual, when they work on a story, they take it off one wall, they put the story they're working on the edge of their monitor or their desk, and then they move it over when they're done. Well, in that sense, in XP, while XP does have some ideas about collective ownership, or in terms of the team responsibility, there is also an individual ownership in that company that I mentioned, because they're actually taking the work item and that's your story that you're implementing. So there is a certain degree of that's for that individual. Part of the thing about the Kanban board is it's not an individual's board. It's not my board for my items. You have your own board for your own items. It's a team board for the entire team's items, work items. And as a result, the entire team is actually responsible for delivery and for the ownership of the board. So if certain items are getting stuck at one of the earlier phases, like you notice that there's 5 or 6 items, work items have been stuck in design for a week. That's something that is not just whoever's focused on that is their problem. That is something that is everybody's problem, and everybody should be interested in addressing it. Here's another thing that goes on top of the Kanban board is something called work in progress limits. My apologies. So sometimes what you can find is that there are bottlenecks in workflow. Okay, let's take, for example, testing. The example there we had was coded and then tested and reviewed. Well, it may be that the way you do testing involves integration with the existing system. And while you may have, in terms of your infrastructure, be able to have, 8 different or 10 different features or work items being implemented at once, coded at once, your testing infrastructure might only allow you to test one new work item implementation with the rest of the system at a time. So you end up with a bit of a bottleneck where things get stuck in the coded waiting to get into the testing, because the testing happens one at a time, whereas the work items in coding happen in parallel. Well, that's a great example where that's a bottleneck in your workflow. And one of the ways you manage that is by limiting the maximum number of cards in any stage. And when a work in progress limit is reached at a given stage or a given column, the team will work collectively to move items in that stage forward. So that means that the team could, in some cases, look at other ways we can test these things in parallel. Is there more infrastructure we can build to do that? Are there other things we can do to support it? For example, if it's testing and review, maybe we can have more people doing the reviewing of the code while the testing is being done, so that there's somebody doing both of them all the time to make the workflow, or the general flow, I guess, be faster. So this is something that is in here. So you may have a limit of maybe only 10 items or 5 items per column. So if you notice a buildup in one place, it's everybody all hands on deck to try to resolve that. That make sense? Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to just watch a short video that kind of talks about what is Kanban. That it's not very long, so I'm going to pause our recording here and we'll watch this short, I think it's a 5.5-minute video, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it. Start the recording. Okay, so we're back. So what I wanted to say was I think that's a nice example of sort of how to do this and take an abstract concept like Kanban boards, and they did a very practical example of doing the presentation to explain it. Where I think there's still room to sort of discuss is sort of how does this relate to sort of doing a large-scale software example, and that's something we haven't really talked about. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do next is I'm going to talk a little bit of how we understand success, and then what we're going to do is we're going to look at a specific example of Kanban being used in practice. I see a question here. It says, the video mentioned that a Kanban card must have an author who is, why is that necessary when anyone can attempt to move the card forward? So a Kanban, typically it's a point of reference. So when the card is put together, it gives somebody, if I create a card, it was obviously with a particular purpose in mind. It was related to satisfying the product goal in some way. So if it turns out that it can just be an indicator of who's working on a card, who should I go to if I have a question about this card, and so on. So it allows you to sort of relate objects on the Kanban board back with members of the team. So it's really just, that's the purpose. It's not about blame if something goes wrong or it gets stuck. It's more just a way to help you link together those work items or stories with an individual who has more knowledge about it. Make sense? Okay. So what we've done is we've explained what Kanban is with this sort of example of doing a presentation. Now what I want to do is talk about, because with the other approaches we have talked about some of the metrics. How do you measure success, right? We've heard the talk about the idea of you want to be as efficient as possible, maximize flow, and so on. But how do you actually measure that you're doing that? How do you know that the way I'm using Kanban now is more efficient than the way I used to use it? Or how do you understand how efficient it is if you've just started using it, if you're doing it right? So when we think about Kanban and we think about metrics, there are 3 sort of examples that I'm going to give you of ways in which we can actually understand if we're being successful, if we're using Kanban in a way that will contribute to success, where success is the goal of Kanban, which is sort of to maximize this efficiency or maximize flow. The first metric that we're going to look at with Kanban is what's called lead time. And lead time is basically the total time from when a client requests an item to when it is done. So if you think about it this way, is when a feature is created, how long does it take, right, to actually get that feature implemented? Or if you're using Kanban board in more of a support situation, you're talking about when somebody raises a support issue, like it could be that they file a bug report. How long does it take to get that bug report resolved? And that lead time of the total time from when a client requests an item to when it's done, it can give you insight onto which items aren't getting resolved quickly enough. You can also use data on the lead time, average lead time, max and min lead time. You can use that as a way to assess your progress. And you can even set up things like goals with respect to lead time, and this is something that you see often happens in some companies. They say, well, our goal is to do this in this amount of time. So what they're tracking is, yes, they're tracking lead time, but what they're interested in knowing is how many client requests in our case, or how many items exceed our lead time standard. If we say we want to have them done in 7 days, how many of our client requests actually take longer than 7 days? So that's the kind of thing that you could use in terms of one metric. Another metric, and remember, lead time is basically the time it takes to get from in the backlog all the way to being released. So it's the time, lead time is the full time for a given work item to flow through the workflow, through each of these stages. Sorry, I said that wrong. It's the time from when the client requests it. It includes the time from when the client requests it to getting put into the Kanban board, and then plus the time to go through. The time to go through once it's already in the board is actually the cycle time, and that's the time it takes for a work item to move through the workflow. So the difference here between lead time and cycle time is the time in the board. Lead time includes the time from when the client requests it to the time it shows up in the board in the product backlog, because sometimes there can be a period there where it's not reflected. And then the third thing that I have here as a metric is a metric, but it's sort of as well a visualization. It's a way of visualizing information. It's called a cumulative flow diagram. And what a cumulative flow, or CFD, diagram does is it visualizes the number of work items in each stage over time. And it can be used to identify bottlenecks and understand the amount of work at each stage. So it's a way of just seeing how the amount of work grows and shrinks at a given stage over time. And you can do that for every stage. So these are some of the things we can do to measure success in Kanban. Any questions about any of these measurements or metrics? Lead time and cycle time. So the thing about lead time is the total time from when a client requests something to when it gets done. Okay? There could be time involved with that that includes, for example, before it actually ends up in the product backlog, right? Like if you're a client and you meet with somebody from the company, they express the concerns, there's going to be time to take that request, to break it down into work items and then put it in the product backlog. That time and information, that time will actually be factored in. So it will include the time from when the client tells the company, I need this done, all the way to when it gets done. Whereas the cycle time is the time from when it gets in the cycle. So at that point, it's not necessarily a client request, it's a work item. Okay? And a client request could also involve multiple cycles, because a client request could, for example, be 5 work items. Right? 5 work items could need to be completed for a client request. So the lead time could actually be the time to get it into the Kanban board plus the time to complete all 5 work items associated with a request. Whereas the cycle time is just at a unit level of work. It's saying how long does it take for a given work item to make it from the very one side of the Kanban board be pulled all the way to the other side where it's completed. Is that helpful? Okay, great. Yeah, and I think I explained about the extra time before it gets into the board when I first said it, but I did omit the thing that client requests could actually be more than one work item, which is once you kind of think about that, that's probably really a useful thing to think about as the difference between lead and cycle. Okay. So what I want to do now is I have another video and I want to show you an example. And this is an example. It's from a book called Agile Project Management with Kanban. And this book here is actually written by, and apologies for the name, I think it's Eric Brechner. And this is him in the video. He's actually in the video. It's a talk, and he's talking about how he and his team have used Kanban within Microsoft. And I wanted to include this because, as I mentioned before, like, it's one thing to understand how this works by giving you like a toy example like was in the previous video, or explaining it in abstract terms like I'm doing, sort of waving my hands a little bit, I guess, because I don't have a concrete example. I'm talking to you how this works in general, not specifically in a given case. In this video, we'll actually see some of the information about how this works in a particular case in Microsoft. And there's a couple things to pay attention to here for the example that he's doing. One of the things is, for each of his columns here, you'll notice he actually breaks each column down into two parts. And that's important to keep in mind, and you'll see that there. And that has to do with sort of the way they use it. And as it turns out, there are different variations in how you can do this. So let's take a pause on the video, and I'll switch over and we'll watch a segment of the other one. So welcome back, everyone. After just watching some clips from that video, there's a couple things I want to point out here. And one of them is, which I mentioned before, is that what's really interesting about what they're doing at Microsoft, what Eric Brechner mentioned, is that they actually have multiple columns in a given workflow column. So they have a done column where they can clearly see what's done and waiting to move to the next thing versus what's in progress. I like that idea. And they also talked about adding a third column, sometimes called track, where if you have multiple things in a given column and there's a dependency, one has to be completed before the other. That's basically blocked, right? And so those blocked items, you move into the track column and you just track the progress so that you can then know when you can proceed with it. And I thought that was interesting. But again, that's a very specific thing to the way Microsoft does Kanban. And what you'll find is a lot of companies do tailor it to their needs, right? Other places may not have the same issues, and they may manage the dependencies through their prioritization that they use in their backlog. And something else I didn't mention ahead of time is you might be wondering, where in Microsoft was this actually being utilized? So the presenter is actually, I should have mentioned this, is actually an Xbox development manager. And they've actually been using it, and it's been used in multiple teams around building software for the Xbox since about 2011, I believe. So for 10 years now, over 10 years. So I thought it was worth including a little bit about this. And he does talk about, if you want to watch the full video, he does actually spend some time as well answering some questions and talking about specifically about how they've applied it and what they've learned from their application at Microsoft. So just want to share that. Any questions? Okay. With that in mind, then let's proceed. The last thing I wanted to do, and we'll end a bit early today, but the last thing I wanted to do was reflect, and I probably could have also included extreme programming in here, but it is much similar to Scrum in this respects. The key thing I want to point out is something that was mentioned in the video about continuous, the flexibility of Kanban versus Scrum, and this also applies to extreme programming, because remember, with extreme programming, we have weekly cycles and we have quarterly cycles. And at the end of every weekly cycle, we do these releases. And Scrum, the cadence is sprints, right? You have and they use the term, I think, time box is what they said. You have sprints that are anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks long, and at the end of each sprint is when you're often doing a release. Whereas, although you can do it continuous, I suppose, but in general, the idea is you do it at the end. Whereas in Kanban, it's continuous. Whenever something ends up into the done, you could do a release. You can do a release on every single work item if you want. It could be multiple a day. So that's one thing, is that the cadence is continuous. There's no sort of sprints. There's no sort of structure of a weekly cycle like an XP either. The release methodology means you do it continuously as opposed to at the end of one of your sprint or whatnot. The other thing that Kanban doesn't do is it doesn't have any definition of roles. So there's no such thing as a product owner, Scrum Master, developer, where a Scrum Master has different responsibilities or product owner. The roles within a Kanban team are not depend. So I guess Kanban is not dependent at all on the roles. You do not need any special roles in order to do Kanban. The roles that people have within the team are based on whatever your roles are within your organization. So you could have people who are developers, testers, product managers, or owners. Those things can exist, but they're not required, and there's nothing that actually there's no essential sort of roles for ensuring the process. So the process is independent of the roles of the team. So they could all just be developers, everybody. Another thing in terms of Scrum is metrics. So there's this idea of velocity in Scrum, which we talked about already. Do you remember what velocity is? Nobody remembers what velocity is? Yeah, it's about how your completion, your velocity is, because remember you have a fixed, particularly a cadence is usually fixed, right? So say it's a 4-week sprint. How many stories, or more specifically story points, are you doing per sprint? That's your velocity. How many points do you complete per sprint, right? Where a given story has a certain number of points, which are indicator of its work, the amount of work involved, and assuming that you have a good measure of work, then the number of points per sprint is called the velocity. In terms of the metrics for Kanban, we look at the cycle time and the lead time for requests, client requests, the cycle time for individual work items, remembering lead or requests could actually involve multiple work items. And then we also have this idea of the work in progress, where we have limits on that. And we can also use diagrams to see the flow and bottlenecks within our different stages. So there's a few more metrics here, but largely what you're interested in knowing is in Scrum, you're asking how much is going through for a given fixed length of time, right? A sprint. In Kanban, because you don't have any fixed lengths of time, you're instead interested in knowing how fast does it take for something to go through the workflow. Right? So how fast is it going through the workflow versus how many things are going through the workflow for a given period of time. And that's sort of what you're looking at there. The other thing is change philosophy is the last thing where these things can differ a little. And if you want, what you can actually think of here is that in Scrum, changes are made between sprints, right? That's when you do your meetings, that's when you reflect, and you either update information about the product or the process. Whereas in Kanban, there is no because the cadence is continuous, there is no natural time to have a meeting and stop and reflect on Kanban and think about it. So basically, whenever you notice something in Kanban, that's when you fix it, right? If you notice a bottleneck, that's when you figure out what changes need to happen. So the example of that was mentioned in here about when they were getting dependencies and items getting blocked and having to track them. Well, at whatever point they realized that was happening, they came up with the idea that, we should have a track column so we can keep an eye on this. At that point, they changed the way they do Kanban boards to have a third column when needed. Right? That was just decided. And so you can do changes whenever it is needed, not just between sprints. So you just do it on the fly. Any questions about the differences between these? And like I said, you could make a similar comparison from Kanban to XP as you can from Kanban to Scrum. Just happen to choose just these last two because I think Scrum and XP, except for the lengths of time in that, are fairly similar with respect to cadence, release methodology, aren't as similar when it comes to roles and that. So I'm not sure what you mean by this being more autonomous. It's more focused on maximizing flow. Yeah, I mean, you can view it as being more focused on maximizing flow because, yeah, Kanban, I think, is less prescriptive and more flexible because it can fit on however you're already doing things. You don't have to make adjustments to do Kanban, right? You don't have to do, stick with sprint structure. You don't have to define Scrum Masters on your teams. So it is, in that sense, more flexible in that. If you had, for example, with release cycles, let's say in Kanban, you had daily releases. Well, you know what? You could do Kanban with daily releases if you want, right? You just batch up or you queue up all the done items that are ready to be released, and you release them in batch at the end of each day, right? So you can do some of that stuff if you're already doing it. Pure Kanban, sort of as described, I think is very continuous, is very fluid, and is really just about maximizing flow from one side of the workflow to the other. So, and there's another question. What happens in Scrum if you finish all the sprint backflow way ahead of schedule? Do you still adhere to the sprint cadence? No, I mean, it's like anything. If you finish early, right, you would move to the next thing, which is having your meetings, looking at the product, looking at the practices. And what you may actually find is that if you finished early, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that there was a disconnect between your estimations of time and the amount of work or your estimation of how much work of the backlog, the sprint backlog, would take in terms of the amount of time. So somewhere along the way, you were not correct in your estimation about work. So therefore, you would probably reflect on that in Scrum and update it so you could actually have it more consistent amount of work, right? The other thing that could happen in Scrum as well is, in addition to finishing ahead of schedule, it's possible to finish behind schedule, right? I.e., you don't get done by the end, in which case you would then augment the product backlog by adding things back into the product backlog that didn't get completed, or if they got partially completed, the part that didn't get completed would get recorded back in. And this is in some ways similar to what we saw in Kanban, though, don't forget, because in Kanban, if you ended up not being able to fully complete something, or something came up as a result of doing it, you realized another work item that had to be done, you would add it back into your backlog, right? So it's just like, in that sense, it's similar, but the thing is that Scrum would actually, if you were not on cadence, I guess, in terms of your sprint length, you would actually reflect on that and look at how you can address that so that you were actually more in line. Any other questions? Do I have a favorite Agile method? To be honest, that's a good question. I've used XP more than the others. Kanban I quite like for so like it was mentioned that Kanban is actually supported in some of the project management tools like Trello, if you've used Trello, or in Jira, which you can use as well. And I've actually used Kanban. I also use Kanban in my research lab, because Kanban is actually, there is a Kanban board built into GitHub that you can use. So I have actually found that the Kanban board works really well. And I found that to be a useful thing for non-software tasks as well, like keeping track of workflow for tasks I'm doing as an administrator, for example, as an associate dean. So in that sense, Kanban I found more widely applicable, mainly because it's flexible. When it comes to developing quality software, it's less clear to me which one I would prefer. Because I think there is some value in, Kanban sometimes to me, if you don't have an experienced team, if you don't have a team that really understands their jobs, Kanban I think can be harder to do because it is so flexible. Whereas with Scrum, if you have a team with less experience, but you have a Scrum Master, product owner, you can kind of work with a younger team, I think, or I shouldn't say younger, that's the wrong word, my apologies. Younger doesn't mean, what I mean is less experienced team. If you have a less experienced team of developers, it's possible that the structure and the cadence of Scrum would actually be more effective. And having a Scrum Master there would actually be more effective, right? So I think some of it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think there are cases and there are situations where one approach may be better than the other. I've also seen cases where people actually do hybrids and combine aspects they like of both. That's a little less clear to me how effective that is, to be quite honest, because in some of these cases they directly conflict, right? Like the idea of cadence and the release methodologies do conflict. So it's not clear to me that, for example, maximizing velocity and maximizing cycle time are always, in tandem what you want to be doing, right? There may be, your velocity. Anyway, it's just an interesting question about it. They are very much, I think, correlated, but it's not clear to me that one versus the other as a measure produce the exact same results. A little bit of a long-winded answer for you, but I hope that helps. And I see somebody here mentioned about mixing between Scrum and Kanban, and somebody else mentioned about Kanban seems easier to get on track. Yeah, so I think it does have a lower threshold, Kanban does, in terms of entry, a barrier to entry. Okay, so with that in mind, let me just stop there and say, what we've done today is we've done our third lecture on Agile methods. These have really become a dominant software approach, right? You've got startups using them, you've got small companies using them, you've got large, Microsoft is one of the largest software development companies in the world. They're using Agile methods. Think about that, large enterprise software companies are using Agile methods to develop. It tells you how widely adopted these practices have become. And Kanban is one of these practices that has been effective and has been used widely. And it's, in addition to being agile, it's also a lean method, right? Where you're sort of trying to minimize the amount of work that you do, unnecessary work, and really prioritize and do the essentials. I just totally realized, I think I just used this slide and I didn't update this last point. Kanban is not a lean agile method that's built around the notion of sprints. That was when we did Scrum. Kanban is a lean agile method that's built around the concept of a Kanban board and maximizing flow. So I will update the content of that slide when I post it. But that concludes today's lecture. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. If you want to watch the videos that were discussed today again, or watch the second one in full, the links are on the course website. Bye everyone, and I'll see you next time.